On July 25, 1961, John Kennedy went on television at 10 o'clock in the evening and told every American family to build a fallout shelter. He did not phrase it as a suggestion. He did not frame it as a precaution that might be worth considering. He said, in a nationally televised address that every American network carried simultaneously, that the government was requesting $207 million for civil defense, that the primary purpose of that funding was fallout shelter construction, and that he expected American families to do their part. Within 48 hours, Sears had sold out of the shelter-building supplies it had quietly stocked in anticipation of exactly this moment. Within 6 months, an industry that had not existed the previous year was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in sales. By the end of 1961, more Americans were building underground rooms in their backyards than had ever done anything comparable in peacetime. America went underground in 1961, and most people alive today have completely forgotten why. The speech itself was about Berlin. Khrushchev had been pressing for a resolution to the divided city's status for years, and by the summer of 1961 the pressure had become acute. East Germans were fleeing to the west through Berlin at a rate that was draining the Soviet bloc's skilled workforce. Doctors, engineers, teachers crossing the border by the thousands every week. On August 13th, 3 weeks after Kennedy's speech, East Germany would begin building the wall that would seal that crossing for the next 28 years. But in late July, the wall had not yet been built, and Kennedy's assessment of the situation was that the Berlin crisis represented a genuine risk of military confrontation between NATO and Soviet forces in Europe. A confrontation that, given the weapons both sides possessed in 1961, could escalate in ways that would reach American soil. The civil defense request in the July 25th speech was Kennedy's acknowledgment, offered with a directness that surprised many of his advisers, that the American public needed to be told the truth about what was coming, and given something concrete to do in response. Life magazine published its shelter issue on September 15, 1961. The cover showed a man in a white radiation suit against a stark background and the words, "How You Can Survive Fallout." The issue was one of the best-selling editions in the magazine's history. It included detailed construction diagrams for multiple shelter types, a recommended supply list that drew directly from the FCDA's existing preparedness guidance, and an article by civil defense officials explaining what to expect in the days and weeks following a nuclear detonation. It also included, in a sidebar that would generate more controversy than any technical diagram, a piece by a theologian arguing that a family that had built a shelter was under no moral obligation to admit neighbors who had not built their own. The Gun Your Neighbor controversy, as it came to be known, dominated editorial pages across the country for weeks and produced a level of public debate about civil defense that had never existed when the program was a matter of quiet government pamphlets rather than national magazine cover stories. The shelter industry materialized almost overnight. In June 1961, there were approximately a dozen companies in the United States that could be described as fallout shelter contractors. By December 1961, there were hundreds. The market segmented with remarkable speed into price tiers that tracked almost exactly with the American class structure. At the low end, the government's own publications offered plans for a family of 4 to build an adequate shelter in a backyard or basement for under $150 in materials, mostly concrete block, sand, and heavy lumber, assembled with nothing more than basic carpentry skills over a single weekend. At the middle range, prefabricated steel shelters appeared in Sears catalogs and through mail-order advertisements, delivered to the property on a flatbed and installed in a pre-excavated hole over 2 to 3 days, at costs ranging from $500 to $1,500. At the top end, specialty contractors offered fully outfitted concrete bunkers with air filtration systems, chemical toilets, bunk beds, battery-powered lighting, and supply packages pre-stocked according to FCDA specifications, at prices that reached $5,000 and above for a well-appointed installation with all amenities included. The Sears catalog entry for fallout shelters has become the most cited symbol of the 1961 boom, partly because Sears was the most universally known commercial institution in the country, and partly because the specific incongruity of finding a nuclear survival room between the lawnmower section and the home appliance pages captures something essential about what was happening in American culture that year. The Sears shelter was a prefabricated steel cylinder approximately 9 feet long and 8 feet in diameter, designed to accommodate a family of 4 for 2 weeks. It came in a kit, was shipped in sections, and required professional installation. Sears offered installation services through its home improvement network at an additional charge. The supply package, sold separately, included 2 weeks of food, water, a first aid kit, a radiation meter, and the government survival manual. The total cost for the complete system ran approximately $700 installed. Sears reportedly received more inquiries about the shelter listing in the fall of 1961 than about any other product in its catalog that year. The ethical controversy that the Life magazine sidebar had ignited did not resolve itself quietly. Across the country, the question of what a family in a shelter owed its neighbors became a genuine community conflict with a specific, uncomfortable edge that no civil defense pamphlet had anticipated. Ministers addressed it from pulpits, some arguing that Christian charity required opening the shelter door regardless of consequences, others arguing that a parent's primary obligation was to the children inside, and that this obligation was not suspended by the arrival of neighbors who had made different choices. Psychiatrists addressed it in popular magazines, analyzing the psychological toll of having to make the decision in advance and live with the knowledge of what it might require. Neighbors addressed it over backyard fences in conversations that were sometimes cordial, sometimes deeply uncomfortable, and occasionally the beginning of rifts that lasted for years. A family in Chicago that had spent $2,000 on a shelter for 6 had to decide explicitly and in advance what they would do when their neighbors with whom they had lived peacefully for a decade appeared at the shelter door after the sirens. Civil defense officials attempted to sidestep the question by promoting communal neighborhood shelters that would accommodate entire blocks rather than individual families. But the economics and logistics of communal construction proved far more complex than individual backyard shelters, and the communal model never gained significant traction outside of a few model communities that civil defense organizations promoted as demonstrations. What was actually being built in the summer and fall of 1961 varied enormously by region, by income, and by the specific interpretation each family gave to the government's guidance. In rural areas, the existing basement infrastructure of American farmhouses provided natural starting points for shelter reinforcement, adding mass to exterior walls, stocking the existing basement, installing a ventilation system. In suburban areas, the new construction was typically underground. A hole dug in the backyard, concrete block walls poured and cured, a heavy steel door installed at the entrance, and a ventilation pipe extending above grade. In urban apartments, where no such construction was possible, families focused on shelter identification, identifying the designated fallout shelter in their building, verifying it was accessible, and maintaining their own personal supply kit for the journey to reach it. The physical reality of what the 1961 boom produced was not a uniform network of identical underground rooms. It was a patchwork of adaptations, each shaped by the specific conditions of the family doing the adapting. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was, in a specific and somewhat ironic way, both the peak and the beginning of the end of the backyard shelter movement. The 13 days of genuine nuclear tension produced a final surge of shelter construction and supply purchases as families confronted the possibility that the event the shelters had been built for was actually happening. Hardware stores reported their highest sales of shelter-related materials since the summer of 1961. Civil defense offices received volumes of calls comparable to the immediate post-speech period. And then, on October 28th, the crisis ended. Khrushchev announced the withdrawal of the missiles. Kennedy confirmed the agreement. And something shifted in the American relationship to the backyard shelter that the crisis's resolution made visible. The shelter that a family had built in September 1961, with the specific knowledge that it might someday be needed, had spent a year being a theoretical object, something that justified its cost by the security it represented rather than the use it provided. The Cuban Missile Crisis made it real for 13 days. And when those 13 days ended without the shelters being used, a certain proportion of American families concluded, not entirely unreasonably, that the specific crisis they had been preparing for had been averted, and that the shelter had served its purpose by existing. Maintenance costs, the inconvenience of keeping supplies rotated and equipment functional, the social awkwardness of a backyard concrete room that had become a conversation piece rather than a practical installation. These factors combined over the 18 months following the missile crisis to produce a gradual but accelerating disengagement from the shelter program that the government had done nothing to encourage and could do nothing to prevent. By 1965, the backyard shelter boom was over. Sears quietly removed the shelter section from its catalog. Contractors who had expanded their businesses to handle shelter construction shifted back to conventional home improvement work. The FCDA's successor agencies continued to maintain the shelter designation program for public buildings, but the private residential program had effectively ended without announcement, without policy change, and without any public acknowledgement that the national commitment of 1961 had dissolved. What remained were the shelters themselves, an unknown number of concrete rooms, steel cylinders, and reinforced basements distributed across the American suburban landscape, most of them gradually converted to wine cellars, storage spaces, and hobby rooms. As the decade progressed and the specific urgency that had created them faded into something that felt, by the late 1960s, almost embarrassing to discuss.